An application programming interface, or API, is a way for two computers to be able to talk to each other, just like if you're browsing a website, but instead of browsing the site for information, you write code to ask for data from the server. For example, we could go to OpenWeather's website to find the temperature and weather in a specific location, or alternatively, we could use the API to ask for the raw JSON data that contains this information instead of viewing it through our browser. Almost all APIs are RESTful, which means they conform to a number of different constraints. REST stands for Representational State Transfer, and this method was created by a computer scientist called Rory Fielding. A RESTful API is a bunch of unique endpoints that a client can make requests to. When a client makes a request to an endpoint, there is a specific format that it must be sent in. Most importantly, the start line contains both a URL that is the target for the request and a HTTP method. This method is a verb that describes the action that is going to be performed on the server. There are four main different HTTP verbs that can be used for a request. GET request just means you're going to read or retrieve some data. A POST request is for when you would like to create a new resource. Patch is to update existing data, and delete is to destroy data. Following the first line, there are also headers. First is the accept header, which tells the server how you would like to receive the data. Then there is also the authorization header, which tells the server that you are actually allowed to make the request. After the header, a request has a body, the final part of the request. Not all requests have one, but it is where a custom payload of data is added by the client to send to the server. This could be data like a username and password to authorize logging into a website. Once the server receives the request, the server will run some code, usually reads from a database, and then will add some data into a response message. The top of the response is a status line, containing the protocol version and the status codes. The status code will indicate to the client whether the request was successful or failed. The code starting with 200 means that the request went well. Starting with 400 means there was something wrong with the client's request, and level 500 means the server has broken. Similar to the request, the response has headers which tells the client some more information about the server. Finally, the body of the response. This is usually in JSON format, and this is the server's response to what the client has requested. In our example of the OpenWeather API, the server would respond with the weather data from where we requested. The most important factor of an API is that it is stateless. This means that each HTTP request happens in complete isolation. This means that neither the client or the server has to save information from each request and don't rely on any previous requests. Now it's time to learn how to make your very own RESTful API. The most used framework for building an API with Node.js is Express.js. It's very minimal to run and easy to learn. What will I learn? How to make a simple API with various endpoints, and how to incorporate middleware into your API. The first thing you're going to want to do is open an empty directory in Visual Studio Code. We're then going to create a new npm project using npm init-y. Let's go ahead and install Express.js. You'll notice how it adds it to the dependencies inside of the package.json that we just created. Now let's create a new file called index.js where we're going to write the code for our API. We need to import Express and declare a variable for app, which represents the API that we are building. Along with this, we also want to declare a variable for the port our API is going to be running on. We haven't created any endpoints for our API just yet, but let's start it up anyway. The way we're going to do this is by using app.listen, passing it the port we just declared, and then using a callback to console log when app.listen is running. We will just console.log the main URL for the API. We can now run this index.js file using Node, and it should console log the URL for our API. To test if it is working, we can head on over to our browser and enter the URL for the API. We should be greeted with a cannot get / showing that our API is up and working. Let's make our first endpoint for a GET request. We will make it for /employee. The API is going to return an employee ID and the employee name. Using app.get, we can create this endpoint. Our first argument is going to be the URL, which as discussed is going to be /employee. And then secondly, a callback, to be run when the endpoint is requested. The callback is going to be handed two variables, the request and the response. The request is what is sent from the client to the server, and the response is what's sent from the server to the client. Using response.status, we can send the status code back to the client. On top of this, you can also use .sent. This will send any data from the server to the clients. For our case, all we're going to be sending is the employee ID and the employee name. However, this time, instead of using our browser to make the request, let's use something called Insomnia. This is a tool made for making HTTP requests, so APIs. All you have to do is enter the URL you want to make a request to, change the drop down of the verb, and then press send to make your request. When we make a request to /employee, we're now going to receive data from the server. In our case, we're getting the employee ID and the employee name. Now it is time to make our second endpoint, but instead of it being a GET request, let's make a POST request so that the client can send some data to the server. Using app.post and the same way as the GET request, we need to have a URL for the endpoint. This time we are not only going to have /employee, but also a parameter. To do this, after a slash, using a colon and then the name of the parameter. Whatever the user enters into this, we can reference inside of our code. For this endpoint, we're going to be sending the server some data, using the parameter to pass a variable, and then also sending a variable inside of the body of the request. To get the employee ID, we will create a variable called ID, and another one called name. To get the ID from the URL parameter, we will need to use request.params.id, which is the name of the parameter. To get the name of the employee, we will use request.body.name, which is also the request of the variable that was sent from the client. Test to see if this has worked, we will console log both of the variables. Let's make a request to the endpoint and test to see if it works. Adding the URL, setting the parameter, and then setting the verb to post. Here we've been given a 500 error. This means that the server is broken. This is because the server cannot read the body of the request due to it being in JSON format. To fix this, we need to use a middleware to allow the server to read JSON inside of the client requests. To use middleware, all we're going to do is app.use, ending with a bracket. Inside of this, we're going to do express.json. This is the middleware that we're going to be using. What is middleware? Middleware is code that is run before any request is made to the server, so in our case it allows the server to read the requests that have been made in JSON formats. After adding middleware to our server, this request will now be working. So now that we've got our API to receive data, we can add some validation. Let's make it so that the user has to send a name in the body of the request. To do this, we can use an if statement. If there is no name returned back to the user, we must send a name in the request body. Once we have validated the client has sent a name, we can return both back the ID of the employee that they sent to us and the name in one sentence. This is easy to do because we've already made a variable for both the name and the ID. We'll use response.send and inside of the brackets the sentence we would like to return to the client. So here we can test the validation to see if it has worked. We're going to send a POST request without there being a name inside of the body. So you can see that we've got the message back to say that there needs to be a name inside the request body, but we've still got a status 200, which means the request succeeded. So to change this, just before the send, we're going to put a dot status, and inside the brackets, we're going to put 400. So we restart the server and try and send this request again. There you go, you'll see it's a 400 request, which means that it's failed. However, if we're now to send a name inside of the body, let's just do John. There we go, the name of the employee is John and their ID is 1, which is what we've put in the parameter up here. So there we go. So we've now made an API that can both send data and receive data from the client, both of these being very fundamentals of a basic API. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.